All right. It is the week of February 5th, 2023, and this is the Fight Business Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Auger, and it's a little bit of a shorter episode today just because of UFC 284 and the Super Bowl going on. Very hectic this week and weekend. But with that in mind, we still have very important topics to cover, including our lead story regarding the major changes to UFC fighter contracts. So John Nash broke this story over at Bloody Elbow. Some provisions have been added, some have been taken away, some previously removed provisions have been reintroduced with new language. It's a very big deal. We're going to talk about it from a strategic point of view, the UFC's strategic point of view specifically, as to why they introduced these changes now. And we're also going to look at how this may affect the industry as a whole, because this might just be the first domino in the process rather than a UFC specific change. Then we're going to talk about Bellator ratings. So Bellator 290 was on CBS, the first time CBS hosted an MMA card in quite some time. Ratings are in to mixed reviews. I'll talk about whether or not I thought they were good, considering the current linear TV environment, and also whether or not Bellator may put on another card on CBS, because they're kind of non-committal about it as of right now. We're going to briefly touch on Gamebred boxing. Jorge Masvidal mentioned on the MMA Hour with Ariel Helwani that he's going to have a boxing event on April 1st with several former UFC champions, Jose Aldo, Anthony Pettis, lots of big names in the MMA space. We're going to talk about whether or not that's actually a viable substitute to the MMA consumer, and whether it could actually be built upon, or if this is just a one-off, or if it's even really happening, because there's some speculation around that as well. Then we're going to do our quick hits. And lastly, we're going to wrap up some big news regarding a change over at Disney where ESPN is going to be spun off into its own streaming unit. That's very important moving forward in terms of how ESPN will fit into the overall Disney brand, how it could affect UFC media rights going forward. Very big deal there. So lots to cover. Timestamps at the bottom as always, and let's go ahead and dive right in. All right. First up, we need to talk about the major changes that have occurred regarding UFC fighter contracts. So John Nash covered this in his Hey Not the Face podcast. Highly recommend that podcast. He always does fantastic work. He's a bit of a contract connoisseur, which is how he got his hands on some of this information. But he also wrote up an article for Bloody Elbow with Anton Tabula as well, helping out. And we're going to talk about two major parts of the contract updates. There were some other things, including name, image, likeness changes, and some tolling provisions and things of that nature. For the specifics on this, again, highly recommend listening to either John's podcast or reading the article. But we need to talk about two big updates that may affect the industry and will definitely affect fighters going forward. So first up is an arbitration clause that was added into the contract. From the portion of the contract that John revealed, quote, where parties here to seek the resolution of any issues relating to or arising out of this agreement, the bout agreement, and or any interaction or relationship between Zuffa and fighter, which Zuffa is still the UFC, both expressly consent to arbitration instead of court procedures to resolve covered claims. And then it goes on to define those covered claims below. The next highlighted portion here in bold is by using arbitration to resolve disputes, they are giving up any right they may have to a judge or jury trial with regard to all claims subject to this agreement to arbitrate. Then goes on to say, arbitration will be done by either one or three arbiters, depending on if it's requested, and administered by the Judicial Arbitration and Mediation Service, quote, JAMS, in Clark County, Nevada. And then, except provided as this agreement, the JAMS comprehensive arbitration rules and procedures effective as of the commencement of the arbitration shall govern the arbitration proceedings. So breaking that down a little bit, as an independent contractor in my own consulting work, I've seen arbitration come up. I tend to try and redline it, negotiate it out of contracts, mostly because arbitration is a whole different beast compared to going to court. Going to court is a pain in the butt. You never want to do it. if you're an independent contractor and you're feuding with your, client. It's not a fun time. I've never had to do it. Once a long, long time ago, there were discussions about it, but we resolved it amicably, and it wasn't really between us. There was a third party involved where we may have to go to court, and was a whole thing. But it's a whole ordeal. That being said, arbitration it comes down to whoever this service believes is qualified, or panel of people who they believe is qualified, and it's a little bit less, how do I want to say it? It can be held certainly to a lower standard than, say, a court, right? Like, in order to become a judge, you either have to be elected or appointed. You have to know the law inside and out, generally. I mean, again, depends on the judgeship, because we've seen some people get judgeships where you're just scratching your head the whole time. But generally speaking, you usually are an attorney for some time, and then you are appointed, or, you run for election and you win, and you kind of have a certain standard that you're held to by the public and by your peers. Also, everything you do as a judge is generally available to the public, right? Outside of certain proceedings that are deemed closed, essentially, if you want to do a FOIA request, or you want to go to the public courthouse and look up records, you can see, lawsuits that have been filed, certain criminal cases, all that fun stuff. Arbitration, that stuff never comes out. Almost always there's an NDA that says, nope, this is sealed. You're never going to hear anything about this. It's part of the agreement. And depending on the arbitration service, it might be somebody that, okay, was an attorney or taught law, but, was kind of small time, or maybe didn't have a ton of experience in certain areas, et cetera, et cetera. They may be assigned as an arbiter. You still have to, they're not going to assign an old person as an arbiter, but it's not the same standard. And given the UFC's ties to Nevada, right? If you're a fighter, you've got to be a little bit wary, I would imagine. I can't imagine you looking at this and thinking, okay, especially since you have to file with them, right? If you're filing an antitrust lawsuit, you would probably ideally like to enforce the laws of California and file it there, because they tend to be a little bit more pro-union and have more worker-friendly laws. Nevada, not nearly as much, especially Clark County. Vegas, it's not nearly the same thing. I mean, the Fertittas, who were originally partners with Dana White when they bought the UFC, were known for trying to be union busting with their casino workers, right? You can look it up. There's lots to dive into there, but I digress. It's a very big deal moving forward, because it limits a fighter's options for any complaints. And mind you, as Nash pointed out, fighters will have to pay for their own attorneys, their own preparation, all this other stuff. It will be sealed. So regardless of the outcome, if I go and an arbiter decides, okay, yes, you were in the right, like Patrick as a fighter, we rule for you. If another fighter has the exact same issue as me, they'll get another arbiter, and it has to be tried again. And that arbiter may decide, nope, for fighter B, we're going the other way. It could come down to individual arbitration decisions. Changes a lot. And that leads to the second change, or major change rather, that we're going to cover here, which is the waiver of collective action and lawsuits. So again, from the contract that Nash showed on his podcast, and that is in the article, quote, waiver of class, collective, and representative actions to the maximum extent permitted by applicable law. The parties agree that no claims may be initiated or maintained on a class action, collective action, or representative action basis, either in court or arbitration. Keep in mind, again, yes, it is possible hypothetically to do a class action arbitration. This waives that. This means that neither party may serve or participate as a class, collective, or representative action representative or member in any proceeding as to covered claims, either in court or in arbitration. Claims not covered. The claims which are not covered by this agreement to arbitrate are, to the extent applicable, claims that are not subject to binding pre-dispute arbitration pursuant to applicable federal or state law, including claims brought pursuant to the California Private Attorneys General Act, claims currently pending in the lawsuit entitled Lave v. Zuffa LLC, case number blah, blah, blah. Which, to summarize, essentially says this clause does not apply to certain claims, including the original Lave v. Zuffa lawsuit. So the 2017 Cajun Johnson one, that's still up for grabs. This hypothetically does apply to that, although you could challenge it. It could be a whole thing. But the original antitrust lawsuit still in play. This doesn't apply. And again, for a more in-depth breakdown on this stuff, cannot recommend Nash's podcast enough, where he fields a lot of questions about this and really breaks it down in full. But yes, the Supreme Court did rule 5-4 that waivers for class actions were legal. And at this point, if you sign a new UFC contract, you can't participate in something like the original antitrust lawsuit, which is hypothetically right now the biggest threat to the UFC's monopoly, outside of maybe the Ali Act, depending on how you think Congress might go with it. Very big deal. Very, very big deal. It essentially closes the loophole, if you want to call it that, that fighters have used to bring this lawsuit against the UFC, which we know brought a ton of information for journalists like me and Nash and others and media members, and also prevents fighters from possibly, doing a fair bit of damage to the UFC's bottom line, which would be huge right now given Endeavor's debt load, as we've talked about on this podcast multiple times. It's not surprising that the UFC made these changes. I know Nash speculated, why, when the Supreme Court ruled that, 5-4, the class action waivers were legal. That was back in 2018. Why UFC waited apparently until around now, and I don't know when Nash got these contracts, so when they started, et cetera, and he doesn't mention them, of course, because that might identify whose contracts they are and who may have gave them to him, et cetera, et cetera. But he speculates that it might have been done because they had just made changes to 2017. Maybe there weren't enough fighters coming up to make these changes. I would imagine that either A, they have made these changes to certain fighters' contracts that we just don't have access to, or B, I think it's less of, we wanted to wait for the new batch, and more of probably seeing how the political climate ended up in 2020. Right? I think if Trump remains president and the Republican Party has control of both chambers, maybe they move aggressively on this. Given how things shaked out, maybe they feel again that it's safe enough. I don't know. There was a lot of political stuff going on that I think could have affected that decision as well. I don't know that it did. It's just pure speculation on my part. But either way, this change always made sense to do from the UFC's strategic point of view, right? Imagine if you could stop another antitrust lawsuit from being brought against you. It has huge ramifications, because even though we're still not class certified yet with that, and it's been a arduous, grueling process to even get as far as we have, a lot of important information was released to the public because of that lawsuit, right? We got actual UFC financials. We got competitor financials. We got an idea of contracts and how they work, negotiations, emails from Dana White and Joe Silva, former UFC matchmaker, that showed how the inner workings of the UFC were run up until 2015, etc. That's huge. It's been enlightening. It lets us know that the prime goal has been, for quite some time now, cap fighter costs at 20%. And it gives several fighters court certified documents from the UFC itself that prove, like, hey, this is how fighter pay really works here. Right? And yes, things could have changed from that time period, of course, right? Obviously, a lot has changed since then. That's why 2017 has its own lawsuit with Cage and Johnson. And it's been multiple years, multiple changes. We know the sunset clauses were added. We know these new contract changes were made. Who knows what else has been going on? But it still gives you very good insight into how the business works. The UFC, even though they don't really have any competition right now, at least not direct competition, and anything that can threaten their leadership in the market, you still have certain things that could erode their current market share, right? That's what every other competitor is trying to do right now. They're not trying to take the UFC on head to head. They're trying to take away some of the enormous market share the UFC has. UFC is the only profitable, well, next, that's not true. Bellator also was, and I still believe is, but they are by far and away the largest profitable MMA promotion. And part of the reason you have one championship, PFL, what was supposed to be the World Fight League that failed, but other talks of different fight leagues and things. Part of the reason you have new vendor in the market is because that share is massive. And when you have a single company with a massive share, alternatives always have an opportunity. Sometimes, albeit small and not worth it, but they have some opportunity to cut away at that share unless there are true impossible barriers to entry, which is also extremely rare, right? Anybody can start their own promotion. It happens all the time with regional promotions. Technically, you can go head to head with the UFC if you want to try that. You're not going to win, almost certainly, right? But that doesn't mean you can't erode and build yourself up to a point, take away part of their pie. I mean, that's what PFL, One, Bellator have all been trying to do. They're trying to take away some of this massive amount of money and revenue that the UFC is breaking in and bringing in, and take it for themselves, right? Capitalize on it, or generate their own revenue that's completely separate, because MMA fans are craving for more and they want alternatives and they want, just more and more of the sport. I'm sure some of hardcore fans that will watch MMA every weekend. They get so upset. It's like, wow, we had a break for 2 weeks or 3 weeks. No UFC. It's terrible. Well, here's PFL. Well, here's Bellator. Here's One. Right? It's a niche sport. More content that appears to be at a higher level, and especially if you can bring in name value, you can win those hardcore fans over. Does it actually detract from the UFC's business? Well, depends. With some of the fight cards that they've been putting on recently, probably. So again, from the UFC's point of view, you don't want this information out there, albeit, they'll probably win the antitrust lawsuit case. They've got, right now, everything is favoring the UFC to win that. But you don't want to deal with it. You don't want to pay the millions of dollars that you're paying a legal team to fight this thing, which is what they have to do. You don't want to deal with that. This cuts off the head of the snake, so to speak. It stops anybody from doing that forward. Makes complete sense that they would make this change. And given the current political climate, as well as the current Supreme Court, which is very, very conservative and pro labor, not pro union, why not? It's extremely unlikely that if this was challenged in any way, shape, or form, if it got all the way to SCOTUS, that it would be overturned. Could be. It was a 5-4 split decision on the class action waiver, but I mean, more than likely, they've got the courts on their side right now. And again, they'd probably try and force arbitration instead, because that's the whole purpose of the arbitration clause. It's a smart move. It closes the loophole, right? It really does. And as Nash mentions, this is also designed to stop people like Francis Ngannou from, okay, sunset clause is up. Great. You're going to go somewhere else now, even though you were champion. Doesn't hurt the UFC so much right now, right? I mean, they're still very much on the top. They still have the brand name and the recognition where, you're doing Cyril Gane versus John Jones. I'm sure if Jones wins, or probably Gane, but definitely if Jones wins, that's what the UFC would love to happen, because from a business point of view, they can see, well, he's the actual GOAT. He would have beaten Ngannou, and no matter what Ngannou does, it's a good look for them. But if a lot of champions start to do that, and especially with the kind of fight cards they're putting on, where, again, most of these guys are Dana White Contender Series, and it's more for cost-cutting measures, it can start to erode some of the fan base, and it can start to hurt. The UFC is going to be profitable and fine for years and years to come. I cannot see a way of it imploding other than the Ali Act or the antitrust lawsuit, both of which are unlikely. I think the Ali Act a little bit more likely, but still it's a very long shot, right? At least as of right now. That doesn't mean, though, that Endeavor can afford to have the UFC make less money. And what I mean by that is Endeavor still has all this massive debt from buying the UFC, from buying all of these other companies. It went on, a big M&A, mergers and acquisitions, growth strategy, where it acquired all of these different synergistic companies to try and streamline efficiencies and, get profit through things that made sense to work together. And they still have all this debt, and 40% of it is variable, and interest rates are still rising. Feds tapered down their rate hikes, but they're still hiking it up. Even if the UFC is extremely profitable, as it's always been, if it starts to bring in less profit, that hurts Endeavor right now, right? Endeavor wants the opposite. They want to find new partnerships. That's why you've got, stools with sponsors, why you're going to have sponsors all over the place. It's going to look like, marketing ads and a marketing exec somewhere threw up all over the UFC canvas at some point. I think it's going to be nuts, is my prediction. But prime hydration zone, right? But the UFC, again, is their crown jewel, is Endeavor's main cash driver. So they're trying to increase the profits. So even if this just stagnates the UFC a little bit, that still hurts Endeavor's pocketbook as long as interest rates are rising, and they are still rising. So this is, again, a way for the UFC to control some of those bigger names from leaving. And we've talked about Ngannou isn't a proven draw, but he still is a name in the space, and people will still watch him fight, especially hardcore fans. And you've got to be careful about losing your hardcore fan base by having some of these cards where, again, you don't really have a true headliner. They're kind of weak. And all of a sudden now you have Bellator or PFL run head to head with you and not really care. you may lose their viewership, right? We're not there yet, but we're getting closer. And this is a way for UFC to just kind of, nip that in the bud. So strategically, again, now is the time, especially Ngannou being the first and making sure he's kind of the last bigger name that does this is kind of key from a strategic point of view. Will someone challenge it? Will it go to court? Who knows? But it's a bad time to be a new fighter signing a brand new contract if you are looking to build your name up and then use that name as leverage for your next negotiation, right? You still have that, but it's going to be far less successful than probably what Ngannou was able to do with his negotiations. In terms of can a fighter get out of this? I mean, you're not going to get somebody to be able to redline this, right? My business attorney, I'm pretty sure any competent business attorney in the US would take a look at that clause and say, nope, like don't sign it. Would recommend strongly don't sign it. Any competent manager, agent, that didn't have the relationship that managers and agents have with the UFC often would probably look at that and say, no, do not sign it. It is not in the best interest, not in your best interest to sign this document. But with the monopoly power, the UFC brand, it's hard to fight against, right? And in terms of how this affects the industry as a whole, again, I think this is domino number one. I would not be shocked if Bellator, PFL, one other companies look to add this into their contracts. Now, Bellator has been pretty pro-independent contractor, right? That's something that a lot of fighters have mentioned in terms of having much more freedom as a fighter to do other side projects. They feel more like an independent contractor. They're probably not going to want to rock that boat, but PFL, one, they very well might, right? Again, this is looking at a company doing something and saying, okay, that's a good idea. And now that this information is out there publicly, right? Why not? What would be the harm in doing this? Now, these companies right now aren't big enough where, again, you're probably going to run into a lot of this issue, same issues as the UFC, right? But if they hope to grow to that level and eventually get there, or again, we've seen some fighters have issues with certain promotions, and even internally, we've seen one championship have some lawsuits and other things going on. It's not a bad idea to add that in now and then just have that be standard language going forward. I think it would make sense for most promotions to do that unless their relationship is really predicated on you have to appear and feel like an independent contractor. So Bellator might be the exception here, but I would imagine ONE and PFL would probably follow suit and it wouldn't be totally unexpected, right? Now, again, you don't have the same sunset clauses and length of contract and all of that as you do with ONE and PFL generally. ONE, I know a little bit less about. PFL, obviously, it's based per season usually, and all of that stuff. But still, it's an easy thing to add that probably fighters aren't going to think too much about, especially in those orgs right now. And if then that becomes the standard going forward, becomes more boilerplate, it gets less scrutiny generally, right? I think it would make sense for those promotions to add it personally from a business point of view. I don't know the harm in that. But anyway, this is going to really hamper fighters' efforts to, again, leverage free agency, leverage their names, do something that Ngannou did. And Ngannou, yes, a bigger name, but not a McGregor, not a Sanya. I mean, things change drastically for the UFC, right? If McGregor ends up doing what Ngannou did, right? Or Adesanya, or John Jones. Big deal all around. So this is a way to shore that up for them. Makes perfect sense from a strategic point of view, and it just sucks for fighters in terms of negotiating going forward. Let me know your thoughts on these changes. Again, cannot recommend John's stuff enough on this, but we'll see how it affects things moving forward. Will it spur fighters to kind of, move closer to something like the MMAFA? Like, I've seen some comments saying that this might spur them to organize. Will it, push through louder voices for legislation in the Ali Act? I don't know, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. It's a very big deal, and it's the biggest story of the week by far. All right, next up, we've got Bellator ratings. So Bellator 290 aired on CBS, headlined by Fedor Emelianenko versus Ryan Bader. Apologies if you're a big Fedor fan. Fortunately, he got KO'd. It was pretty rough, pretty much expected, I think, by a lot of the community, myself included. But nevertheless, a cool moment with all the legends there. A big deal with Bellator making its debut on CBS and CBS hosting an MMA card for quite some time, or since quite some time, rather. And the ratings that ended up being the final ratings for the show. I know there was a 928,000 floating around, but that was just the Fast Nationals. The final ratings for the show were 1.068 million viewers for its 2-hour plus broadcast. This was just the main card. Prelims were not included in this. As a comparison to other events, you had Elite XC Primetime, which did 4.85 million. Elite XC Unfinished Business, which did 2.62. Elite XC Heat, which did 4.5 million. Strike Force Fedor versus Rogers, which did 4.04 million. And Strike Force Nashville, which did 2.9 million. So keep in mind, Strike Force Nashville was obviously quite some time ago, right? I mean, a long time ago. And so it's important to understand that linear TV has been declining quite a bit since streaming was introduced. And we see year after year less and less viewership. I don't think personally those numbers are terrible. I know Scott Coker was saying he wouldn't be surprised with 3 million, but 3 million is a very, very hard number to get to, right? I would say WWE is very hot right now with its current storyline and WrestleMania buildup, and wrestling in general is hotter than it's been in a while. And even with their flagship shows on Fox and USA, right? Like Fox, I think the highest they've had recently is like 2.7 million or something like that, which is big, but it's not like what it once was. And 2.7 million tends to win the week around cable shows nowadays. So very, very different landscape. I think 1.068 million is solid, honestly. It's the first time you've shown MMA in pretty much a decade. You have Fedor, which is a big name for old school MMA enthusiasts, but if you're newer, you might not know Fedor, you might have heard of him, but you're not going to be like a die-hard Fedor fan, right? Like back in the day. Against Ryan Bader, who again is a name, but not like the name by any means. I think it's a solid number, especially for a debut. Are you going to be able to top it? I don't know. Does it make sense for you to come back and do another card? I think it probably does if you're still looking to sell, right? If you're able to show that Bellator can draw to a certain extent semi-regularly on a bigger media station, that is much more likely to get you some sort of deal and buyout. If you can go and say, hey, look, we are pulling these numbers consistently, it cannot hurt, right? And Paramount obviously was not the place for Bellator. They were not getting great ratings. It was kind of a struggle. These CBS ratings, again, if you compare it to UFC on ABC, right, I believe that was 1.22 million. So it's not that far off. And that's ABC. That's a comparable broadcast station. So ideally, because especially since one of the fighters, the biggest draw, you would assume, has retired, you host another card on CBS, and even if you can get 800K or 900K in that range, that shows to someone, okay, this has value. There is an audience there. There is a target consumer. How do we utilize and marketing and targeting to get more money out of each consumer and to get and acquire new consumers? But there is a proven market for it. One thing I have learned in the VC startup world, especially consulting for them, is it's all about proving there's a market. You can get a ridiculous amount of money upfront if you can show some sort of proof that customers want to buy your product or service. I've seen paper prototypes where literally somebody says, like, yeah, here's my idea for this thing. I would love it. Will you sign a piece of paper that says that you would pay this much if I created this? And you're not a friend, you're not a, family member, and you don't have to commit to doing that right now. But, if there were pre-orders here, would you do this? And I've seen somebody bring in, 50 signatures off the street or what have you, and that gets pre-seed funding, right? It's nuts. You've got to prove your market. You do that, the rest can come. Having viewership around this level, I think, proves that there's a market for Bellator. And if you're looking to spin it off and sell it, a buyer might look at those numbers and think it's a little bit more valuable compared to not having that information, right? Because if you look at previous linear numbers on Paramount, not that great. And Showtime, again, what we know from their ratings, also not great, but Showtime is a premium cable channel, so that's not super surprising. I think it makes all the sense in the world for them to set up a card on CBS, stack it with some of their biggest names, and see what happens, right? Or do the final of the lightweight tournament or something on CBS. That also may intrigue people, because if it's the tournament that's drawing, well, okay, that might be helpful, especially when compared to like PFL's tournament format, right? I think you do it. If for some reason you are not trying to sell Bellator, or you're not sure you can get the ratings that you want, maybe less so. Still probably worth it to get more advertisers on board, but you've got to have big names. You can't do 1.068 million with Fedor's card and then come back and do 400K, 500K on CBS. That hurts you. That's a big risk. But if you can line up the right fighters and line up the card correctly, I think it makes all the sense in the world for Bellator to go back on CBS and see what they can draw. That's my thoughts on the subject. Let me know if you prefer Bellator on CBS, if you watched it on the app anyway. I know several people that watched it on Paramount Plus didn't even bother CBS. Let me know your thoughts on this, because I thought the ratings were solid, right? They're not home run numbers by any means, and obviously a lot less than what Coker wanted, but I thought it was still good stuff overall. All right, next up, we need to talk about Jorge Masvidal's Gamebred boxing, which is April 1st. So Jorge went on the MMA Hour with Ariel Helwani. Helwani teased that he had to make some big announcement. They kind of just goof around for a bit, talking. A lot of people thought, oh, no, there's no announcement coming. And then Masvidal drops information that Gamebred Boxing 4 is going to be on April 1st. All bouts are going to be 6 rounds, except for the main event, which I think is 8. And they will all be pro bouts, not exhibitions. And the lineup for this card is as follows, at least on paper right now. In the main event, it's Anthony Pettis versus Roy Jones Jr., which means Pettis is going up in weight quite a bit. Vitor Belfort versus Ronaldo Souza, Jacare. Jose Aldo versus Jeremy Stevens. Pearl Gonzalez versus Gina Mazzani. Paul Daly versus Anthony Pretty Boy Taylor. And then Devin Cushing versus Damian Marciano. Dylan Klecker versus Josh Burns. And then Bai Nguyen versus to be determined. So if you'll notice, you've got a ton of MMA fighters on that card, right? In fact, the majority of them are former bigger MMA names. Obviously, Pearl Gonzalez, Gina Mazzani, not as much, but Paul Daly was a big name in Bellator. Jose Aldo and Jeremy Stevens, obviously, Vitor and Jacare, Anthony Pettis. And then you have some bigger names of boxing, at least two, which is Roy Jones Jr. and Anthony Pretty Boy Taylor. I mean, which they're not the biggest names, but they're known names. They have name value. This card on paper is intriguing, right? And it's intriguing to an MMA fan in particular. And that's the marketing and the idea behind the strategy. When you look at what Jake Paul did, which was, hey, I'm going to fight Ben Askren. I'm going to fight Tyron Woodley. Numbers that they got, at least the first fight. Second, Woodley, not as much. But still, it was a new, intriguing thing. I mean, let me back that up. It wasn't completely new, but it was a new way of doing a celebrity boxing match, essentially, with a YouTuber with a huge following versus, a pro fighter of some sort. And I mean, it's led to a lot of success for Paul in the combat sports realm, right? I mean, he could have kept doing YouTube videos. He and his brother make a crazy amount of money through all that stuff. Paul obviously takes combat sports seriously, and this was a way to build his brand in that arena, and it's done very well so far. And now he's partnered up with the PFL. Seems to have worked, right? Not to mention, Askren and Woodley probably got bigger paydays than they ever got in the UFC. So again, as a substitute, worked pretty well. Masvidal is trying to go one step further with this, which is instead take bigger MMA names and have them box and have that be a way as, hey, we're not competing with you directly, UFC, because it's MMA. And obviously you don't have people on the active UFC roster fighting. But you have former champions. You have Pettis. You have Vitor. You have Aldo. I mean, those are bigger names in the MMA space. And yeah, I'd be lying if I wasn't intrigued if this card happens, which again, we'll see what happens come April 1st. But I'd be lying if it wasn't intriguing to say, okay, I might go ahead and watch this card. I'm sure a ton of hardcore fans will. I know MMA media outlets are going to cover this simply because of the names on the card. Not a bad strategy. Now, how lucrative will it be? I don't know. Right? It's going to be interesting to see what the viewership numbers what the viewership numbers are for this event. Again, should it happen? And it's something where if this was an exciting event, had some great fights, and again, it's all just boxing and stand-up. People like it. This is a way to build Gamebred boxing, which is something that Masvidal might very well, obviously he wants to do, but might very well take to heart and put more and more effort in, right? Imagine if this does better than expected numbers, and then all of a sudden you're seeing Silva versus George St. Pierre, who recently got sunset out of his MMA clause to box. Yes, I know it's not the MMA fight we all want, and it's way past their primes, but you can't tell me that wouldn't intrigue people, especially probably all of you listening to this podcast, right? In some form or fashion. It's an interesting strategy. And it's not creating a direct competitor, it's creating a substitute. It's saying, hey, look, you know and love these guys from MMA. Now see them in XYZ. It's a usually giant conglomerates do that, right? Where you have a TV show or movie star of, oh, you've seen him in this. Now you can get an action figure of him, or now watch him in this, right? But same type of thought process here is, okay, you loved these guys. This is why you watch the product. Come watch them do other things. Will it take away from the UFC's market share? Probably not, right? If they go head to head with a fight night card, it might decrease viewership a little bit, which again could slowly but surely erode their advertising and media rights negotiations if it happened consistently. But right now, not really much of a threat. It's a substitute product, and it's a way for Masvidal to hypothetically create value out of an existing market share. Will this actually work? I don't know. Will this card actually stay together? I also could not tell you for the life of me. But if it does, it's not a bad idea, in my opinion. Why not try it out, right? I can't imagine, again, I don't know how much of Gamebred boxing is financed by Masvidal himself. Probably not a ton. But, you know, depending on how much of Masvidal's own money is in this thing, and wow, my hair just went wild, huh? Depending on how much money Masvidal's is in this, it's worth a shot, I would say. That's my thought on it. I know that might get some flack from a lot of people. I just think from a business perspective, it's an interesting tactic, right? It's trying something new. I love when businesses do that. This is Masvidal doing that. Let me know if you're going to watch this card. If you think the card will stay together, I'd love to know the over-under on if this card actually comes to fruition. But if it does, are you going to be watching it? Does it intrigue you? Are you like, no, I don't care about this, especially for boxing. Get out of here. Or, oh, yeah, this is awesome. I'd love to see Aldo fight again. I'd love to see Fedor versus Jacare in boxing. Let me know, because it's an intriguing gambit here. All right, next up is quick hits. Going to be very quick with this. Only a couple. First up, Sean O'Malley has signed a new 8-fight deal with the UFC. He did so without a manager. Says he's happy with the amount of money he's getting. Again, this just highlights what we talked about last week in terms of managers really need to find new creative ways to keep that percentage, because once you hit a certain level of stardom or name value in the UFC, you can probably negotiate and get what you want or close to what you want on your own, right? There's diminishing returns on what a manager can actually do for you at this point. It is an 8-fight deal, which from the UFC's point of view is great because you lock in O'Malley for the rest of his prime. He's about to fight for a title. If he blows up, he's locked into that deal, and you're going to make a ton of money off of him. O'Malley probably left money on the table. I would guess he definitely did. How much? I don't know. Was it worth it to him? Who knows, right? It's kind of a, damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario in some ways, where if he goes out and especially with some of his injury issues, he gets hurt or he loses in the title fight and then kind of loses some of his luster, who knows what happens. But overall, it really highlights the managers need to step up their game to keep that percentage. And the UFC is going to keep trying to lock fighters in for 8-fight contracts, especially if you are a potential breakout star, which I think they still view O'Malley as. Next, we need to talk about Tim Simpson forming his own MMA management firm. So he's a longtime Paradigm agent. Tim Simpson was. He's now started his own firm, the Chosen Advisory Group, which, has a big list of names. You've got Adesanya, Leon Edwards, Jiri, Max Holloway. Big deal. Again, this just shows the kind of transformation happening in the MMA manager space. I've talked before about how Holloway has been creative with his agents and managers. I'm sure Simpson probably said something to him that was along those lines, and getting that type of roster pretty fast is a big deal. So we'll see what happens with it. We'll see if it becomes a true challenger to dominance, which is really the main group of MMA fighters. I mean, you've got other camps, of course, but obviously Ali Abdelaziz's Dominance MMA is the largest, most notable. I don't want to say notable, the largest, bigger name MMA management group, right? So we'll see if this really shakes things up, if it's just kind of a shift because Tim wanted to go his own way and start his own firm for monetary reasons. Who knows? But yeah, it's important enough that we had to call it out. And then lastly, on the quick hits, we need to talk about the UFC's Performance Center in Mexico. So this was, again, kind of rehashed. This had been announced a long, long time ago, but they've actually, announced plans now. Okay, we're opening this. You're going to keep seeing UFC PIs open up in markets that they want to move to, right? Talked about this before. China was the first, made complete sense to do that and kind of build their brand there. Now they're moving into Mexico. Wouldn't be surprised if they eventually look at moving into Southeast Asia, India, those types of markets as well, right? They're going to keep looking for new markets to go into, build these PIs, do the combines, try and find fighters that have, the most likely to succeed, best chances, and also have the marketability they want. It's a good strategy for the most part. It also gives them goodwill. It allows them to take some of their debt and put it into real estate, which is a good way to avoid certain taxes and certain fees and all that fun stuff. Makes a lot of sense. That was quick hits. Let me know if I missed anything from this week, but some notable things in there. All right, last thing we're going to talk about today is Disney has announced that ESPN and its streaming offshoot will, quote, become a standalone unit for the first time. This is a big deal. I am reading an article from February 9th, 2023 in the Sports Business Journal talking about Disney cuts back on spending costs for streaming profit. Some good analysis in here. Sports Business Journal always does have solid stuff. But in this article, they talk about the fact that ESPN is going to become a standalone unit, which means it's not going to be rolled up under particular things. Pitaro, the head of ESPN, Jimmy Pitaro, is going to have a lot more power and kind of a lot more reign to run with stuff. And according to Brooke Barnes of the New York Times, quote, this was instantly interpreted as making the sports behemoth easier to spin off or sell should Disney decide to pursue such action. So for years now, there's been talk about ESPN being sold, right? Especially, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago when you had the big round of layoffs at ESPN where multiple shows were cut. Many anchors lost their jobs. Seemed like, okay, you're cutting costs in ESPN to tee it up for a buyer, have them come in and take it over with as little, losses as possible or debt as possible, and then going to go that way. That didn't happen. And, even just a year ago, there was an article where Bob Iger, who was CEO then left and now CEO again, talked about how they were doing a huge push on acquiring sports rights, and ESPN growth was going to be a main target for Disney in 2022. That obviously didn't work the way they wanted. You had a different CEO, but the last Q4 numbers were not great, and it led to that Sunday night switch or whatever it was. Yeah, I believe it was Thursday or Sunday night switch where Bob Chapek was relieved of his duties and Bob Iger came back. Now Iger has a little bit of a different tune compared to a year ago. A year ago, he said, yep, we're going all in, dedicating, a third of our, acquisition rights towards sports. ESPN is going to be a huge factor. Here, he is quoted as saying on the most recent earnings call that ESPN continues to create real value for us. We just have to figure out how to monetize it in a disrupting world. Barnes then goes on to the New York Times, talks about how ESPN used to have more than 90 million subscribers. It's down to closer to 75, which is a pretty big loss. But that ESPN has been able to maintain its profitability. Iger has pushed back on selling ESPN to a point, but also said that at one point he had explored the idea of spinning off ESPN when he wasn't CEO, when Chapek was technically running things, but they decided against it. Profitability is going to be a huge piece of this. Iger is quoted as saying, as long as it continues to be profitable, they're not going to spin off ESPN. He believes it's a very, very valuable property for the company. When talking about the NBA and getting those rights, because that's kind of hanging in the balance right now. But it's really all about profit. He makes several other quotes in this article. Quote, ESPN has been selective in the rights that they bought, and we've got some decisions that we have to make coming up. Not anything particularly large, but on a few things, and we're simply going to have to get more selective. They also, announced, forget what day specifically, but they announced this week that they're cutting 7,000 employees from Disney. And while it doesn't seem to be like those people are going to be leaving ESPN, it's still certainly something to take note of, right? In the grand scheme of things, and the way you decipher all these quotes that I've pointed out and everything else, is that Disney had a very rough Q4 and a rougher than expected 2022. Moving forward, they are still focused on sports acquisition rights. Their parks were extremely profitable, right? That's really the shining example of good news in the latest conference call. But you've had a subscriber dip in ESPN Plus and Disney Plus and ESPN Plus, and you've got to keep those streaming services or the group between ESPN and ESPN Plus. You've got to keep them profitable given the current investor environment. They recently had an activist investor try and make some noise with Chapek at the helm. Auger's new cost-cutting measures, which they're seeking $5.5 billion in savings, which is huge, has kind of led to him backing down. But they're in saver mode, and with that, the fact that they're talking about NBA being tenuous and all this, with that, they're doing everything they can to keep everything profitable. That's a big reason why, in my opinion, everybody blamed the UFC for the latest pay-per-view increases. But remember, those decisions are largely made by the media provider, right? UFC gets a certain amount, fixed dollar amount, and then if a pay-per-view hits above a threshold, they get a bonus. But you've got to assume, based on everything I know, I would assume ESPN gets to make the final call of pricing it because you're buying it through ESPN, right? That's part of the deal they worked out by being the sole exclusive UFC provider, which is, I think, a huge reason why you've seen another price increase. So it's $80 a pay-per-view compared to just $60 a couple of years ago. They're trying to make these things more profitable. It's not just ESPN. You have Netflix raising prices. The bundle itself with Disney is going up, right? Streaming services are loss leaders. We've talked about this last week and a couple weeks before too. They're loss leaders. That's fine in a good macroeconomic environment. It's not okay in a downturn. That's when heads roll. That's when investors get angry, becomes an issue. They want profitability. That's what Auger's trying to do here. But where this becomes precarious from an MMA fan's point of view is, again, UFC media rights are up for negotiation in just a couple of years. And if the downturn starts now and doesn't come out by the time those rights are, up for renegotiation, it's very possible Disney won't give them what they want and they'll have to look elsewhere. That's a very big deal. I think because sports are still a big focus and ESPN has been happy with UFC's numbers so far, I don't see that in jeopardy yet, but it depends. These fight night cards, the pay-per-views going forward, right? We know that Disney was not thrilled about pay-per-view numbers last year. I think that's part of the reason UFC worked out Conor and Chandler and all this, because they want to renew that deal with Disney and get, ideally double what they got originally. They want to keep ESPN Disney happy. I expect more Conor, more bigger names to boost those numbers, to boost viewership. Maybe some more stacked fight night cards. I don't know. To me, I feel like that's part of the compromise. They probably worked with ESPN where they're like, look, these numbers aren't going to be great because we need to cost cut. But, for the big pay-per-views, we'll get you your money. Well, and for the bigger events, we've got you. Wouldn't be surprised if that's kind of how the dialogue is going right now. But if ESPN is sold, right, to another company, that changes the entire game as well. I am assuming most of the negotiations for all this, again, when it came to the ESPN UFC deal, was between Ari Emanuel and, yes, I'm sure Bob Iger to an extent, but I mean, I'm sure Pitara was involved, right? As he had to be as head of ESPN. As things move forward, or the head of ESPN at the time, I truly forget if he was. As things move forward, if ESPN gets sold off to CBS, not that would happen, obviously, since CBS is rumored to be trying to spin off Bellator. But let's say they're sold to some other major conglomerate. Let's say Viacom CBS does buy it somehow. That could change the entire dynamic. Doesn't change the initial contract, sure, but negotiations could easily change in a heartbeat, right? It's not the case right now. Right now, if anything, ESPN has more power than ever in terms of determining what content they want, their rights negotiations, all that stuff. But if a big name comes and scoops up ESPN, let's say billionaire guy, Let Vanek or something. I'm sorry, it's super late, tired. But, the billionaire that owns DAZN decides, you know what? I want to go ahead and buy ESPN. Changes the whole game. Now, these are all way out there hypotheticals, I know, but it's still something to consider. And in my opinion, the fact that it is spun off into its own unit, I would agree with Brooks that signals you're not saying it outright. In fact, you're in interviews saying, we're not looking to do that, but you're signaling, yeah, this is for sale. That's how I would interpret it. And you got to wonder how Endeavor and the UFC are feeling, because if ESPN gets new bosses, it's almost certainly going to affect how they do business, and it might not be for the better. It may. Maybe they're bought by somebody that, again, is all about Endeavor and Ari Emanuel's vision and what the UFC does, and great. But it's a new risk that they have to factor in, especially going into 2025. So with rumors persisting and seeing how ESPN does over the next several quarters, don't be surprised that if ESPN starts to falter a little bit and Auger changes his tune about selling it, if UFC doesn't push harder and harder for more Conor, more bigger name cards, all that type of stuff. Because they'll want to show the best possible product they can if they think ESPN is going to be bought by somebody and they're not sure who it is. They want to get those double rights. That throws a massive potential wrench in those plans. So they're going to present the best foot they can forward as a precaution. Now, if ESPN under Disney, even as a standalone unit, starts picking up profitability, doing better numbers, my guess is, Auger hangs on to it. No harm, no foul. They can go back to negotiating with everybody they know. They kind of know the lay of the land, etc. But only time will tell in that arena, and it's going to be an interesting one. We're going to keep an eye on it. I'm going to keep you informed on it. But yeah, look for key things. First one being the NBA rights on ESPN. Look for news about that. That's going to be the first ball to drop, so to speak. And depending on how that shakes out, I think a lot of other things could happen. Let me know your thoughts on all this. Do you think that ESPN will be bought by somebody else? Do you think it would affect UFC? Who would you picture buying ESPN? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, because there's a lot of potential options, and some could be really good for the UFC and some could be pretty terrible. So it's an interesting time for sure. That wraps up another episode of the Fight Business Podcast. Appreciate you guys for listening. If you're on YouTube, hit the like, subscribe, bell notification. If you're on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, any of those podcasts. Appreciate you as always. Enjoy the hopefully awesome UFC 284. And if you follow the Super Bowl, which I'm assuming a lot of you do, enjoy the party or times that you're going to have watching that. And until next time, get money.